Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Welcome to today's episode of the Metabolic Link. I'm your host, Dr. Dom D'Agostino, and our guest on this episode is Dr. Ian Lake. He's a seasoned NHS doctor and a type 1 diabetes advocate who spent nearly 4 decades in medicine. He was diagnosed with latent autoimmune diabetes as an adult, or also abbreviated LADA. And at the age of 36, he was diagnosed. Dr. Lake managed it with conventional treatment for over 2 decades before implementing a very low carbohydrate lifestyle, leading to remarkable improvements in his glycemic control and also in his reduction in the dependence on insulin. So he now promotes insulin optimization, emphasizing how diet, lifestyle, and insulin management can better control type 1 diabetes. Dr. Lake is also the founding member of the Public Health Collaboration and an advisor to the European Keto Live Center. Today, we'll be diving into his unique approach to diabetes management and the science behind insulin management and metabolic health. Dr. Ian Lake, thank you so much for being on the Metabolic Link podcast. You are really a pioneer in spearheading the use of low-carb diets and sometimes ketogenic diets for the metabolic management of type 1 diabetes, which is of high interest to many of our listeners, and kind of personally interested in this after having a student do his PhD under me, Dr. Andrew Kutnick, who has type 1 diabetes and really just had an amazing kind of response to this. But before we begin, I need to mention, thank you all for listening to the Metabolic Link podcast. And if you want to support this podcast, it would help tremendously if you like, share, and leave us a review. We would really appreciate that. And give us feedback and suggestions too for other people you would like to have on the Metabolic Link podcast. So, Dr. Ian Lake, you have been a doctor for about 40 years now, or 37 years or something.
Yeah, too long.
Yes. And you work as a general practitioner in the UK. Your degree is in medical cell biology and biochemistry. You got from Liverpool University in 1981 and qualified as a doctor of medicine in 1985 from Southampton University. And you were diagnosed with latent autoimmune diabetes type 1 at the age of 36, the late age of 36. And you managed it by using the dose adjustment for normal eating, I guess, which is kind of like the standard approach for the first 20 years. And then you changed, and I would like to kind of talk about how you learned about changing to a very low carb diet with amazing results. And now you are educating other people and really focusing more or less on helping patients and then educating people about this low carb approach for type 1 diabetes. So I'd like to kind of delve a little bit into your personal background. I'm curious, when you first got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, what symptoms did you have? And I guess maybe taking a step back, too, was as a clinical practitioner, you were sort of what got you into the field of medicine and then specifically for type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, I sort of had a leaning towards medicine from an early stage, really. And I did a degree in cell biology and biochemistry and felt I wanted to use the knowledge of that. It's more technical, really, in the medical field. But as I went through my training, I got more interested in sort of general practice over and above other aspects of more technical medicine, really. So I was trained in a conventional way, and as a generalist, we obviously have a lot of different topics to cover, right from safeguarding right through to ear, nose and throat orthopedics, etc. So we rely heavily on guidelines and statements coming out and training materials coming out from what I call the clever people, yeah, who sort of hand it down to us to get the basics that we need to know when to hand over care to a more specialist level. So when I developed type 1 diabetes, age 36, it was a pretty quick onset. I was a bit tired before, a month or so before, but I was working day and night shifts as a doctor, so I sort of expected that. And I had a young family at the same time. So a wake up call really was when I fell asleep in a car wash and somebody knocked on the door and said, "Do you mind moving on?" Um, and 2 or 3 days after that, I got classic symptoms of type 1, raging thirst and raging desire to urinate. And it didn't take any cleverness to diagnose that. I diagnosed myself
Yeah. Yeah.
within a couple of hours. Blood glucose was 20 odd, so that's 20 times 18, so that's 300 and odd, 380,
Yep.
something like that. And I had just a small amount of ketones and was put on insulin straight away. At those days, we didn't measure anything apart from the clinical impression because it was that long ago, really, in the UK. So I went straight onto insulin, had a long honeymoon period of 2 years where I needed very little insulin at all, 2 to 4 units a day, which was remarkable. And but I was still on a higher carbohydrate diet, so maintaining a good level of natural insulin production. But obviously, we're told to expect that that insulin production is going to wane over time, and it did. And then for the next 18 years, I spent sort of on the what we call the carbo coaster, the carb roller coaster of trying to correct your blood glucose as it goes up, and then you put insulin in, it brings the glucose down. And it was for me, it was very, very difficult. I liked to think that I was going to exercise my way out of trouble, and we've heard that quite a few times from lots of doctors
Yeah.
in this field. Because I felt, well, I can get control of the blood glucose, and cardiovascularly, I'll be a little bit more protecting myself with physical activity. But over time, you just feel the claws of type 1 getting to you. And over 20 years, I started to get joint pains regularly. I regularly couldn't do long distance runs because of that and pulling a calf muscle or something, which I'll touch wood, but I've never had since I changed my diet. And just feeling generally old, palpitations. The worst thing was actually an early neuropathy, so where the nerves start to get damaged, and just standing up from sitting, I had to put my head between my legs 4 or 5 times a day, and that was quite embarrassing in a clinical setting when you're a generalist trying to run a clinic. So things were just starting to get me down really. So I'd read Richard Bernstein's book with an accidental Google to find about a bit about type 1, probably something personal. Read it, put it down, and thought about it. I thought there was a bit too much fat in there for me, the way I'm trained. Generally believing in the low fat sort of lifestyle to protect against heart disease. And of course, people with type 1 are 3 times more likely to get heart disease. So there's this difficulty of what are you going to do about it? Are you going to take this seriously or not? And at that time, all my training was geared towards telling me that low fat diets were the answer to, or a way out of reducing, a way into reducing your risk of not getting heart disease. So I put him down for a year. And then I got my first letter to say, you've got early retinopathy. And that, and combined with all of the other symptoms, I felt I've nothing to lose really, and just went straight on to keto within a day of doing that. I just reread the book and then just applied myself. But the key thing about this was the results were so dramatic. It was like from the first meal, for the first time in my life over 20 years, the relief of getting control of your blood glucose and having control of it was immense. I can't believe how easy it was to control my blood sugar. And from there, one meal at a time. It took about 2 to 3 months to refine it. But after that, I was convinced that, had I known this information at diagnosis, I may have done a lot better throughout my life than I did. So that's my backstory.
Thank you for sharing that. Were you using a continuous glucose monitor? And what was, for example, your hemoglobin A1C prior to going low carb? And did you, use like a closed loop insulin pump? And what was your approach to management?
So at the time, I'm still on pens right now, but I've been on pens all the time, sort of long acting, rapid acting, basal bolus, as we call it. And my HbA1c at the start was around about 6% in the first 2 years in the honeymoon. and then it crept up to 7 to 7.5%, and it was there for many, many years. And of course, the guidelines at the time were about 7 to 7.5%. So I thought I was doing okay. Little did I know,
Yeah.
really. And then I had sort of a life crisis, as we all do, defocus a little bit on type 1, and it went up to 8%. And at 8%, I for 2 years, that was going on at that level, and I just couldn't get control at all. I think I was poor at good quality insulin management. I wasn't that applied to it. And I was swinging sugars all over the place, tending to run quite high. And one of the reasons for running high was this idea of safety, because if you're running a GP clinic and you don't want to go hypo in front of a patient,
Mhm.
really, so you
Mhm.
tend to run higher than you'd like to do normally. And of course, we were told that, running at about 180 was okay. It's not too bad.
Yeah.
It's not brilliant, but you could bring it down probably to a little bit less. But you wouldn't certainly want to be in the 80s, which is where I like to aim for right now,
Yeah.
because that was it. And of course, quite rightly, that is associated with risky control if you're on a high carbohydrate diet. So for most people getting a low HbA1c on a high carbohydrate diet, they are at risk of hypos, but because that doesn't apply on a keto diet.
Yeah.
So,
That's right.
so from the first 3 months of going from 8%, I went straight down to 7%, and then 3 months after that, I went down to 6%, and I've stayed around that level for the last 9 years.
Mhm.
I've had lower, I've had slightly higher, but by and large, I've stayed around the upper level of normal. I can't quite get it. I've had a couple below 6%, but I struggle to get that far down, even if I have really good control. But so it has been remarkable, and I think it's been life transforming for me.
If you're going to take something every day, it becomes especially important to make sure that it does not contain anything that's going to harm you. So that's why I love Puri O3 fish oil. It's third-party tested for more than 200 harmful contaminants, including heavy metals, pesticides, dioxins, BPA, the forever chemicals, PFAs, and more. O3 offers a high dose EPA and DHA concentration of 80% omega-3 concentration in the oil as a triglyceride form. The product is certified with the Clean Label Project and the International Fish Oil Standards, and also is certified by the Friends of the Sea, which ensures that the fish oil is sustainably sourced. It's got, I take it every day. It's got a QR code that you can scan, and it shows you your exact lot number, exactly what's in your product. It's got over 200 different chemicals that they test for and the exact amounts that are in the batch that you have. I typically eat a ton of fish, so my omega-3 index is kind of like off the charts. I have kind of transitioned away from fish this month. I'm eating more venison. And so I've added omega-3 supplementation if I'm not eating a lot of sardines or a lot of mackerel. I highly recommend this product if you're going to use a fish oil supplement. Oils, especially fish oils, tend to be one of those supplements that you don't want to skimp on, can be very high in contaminants, and lipophilic contaminants can concentrate and actually get into your adipose and store. They build up over time. So we have a great deal for you right now. You can get 20% off. And if you choose their already discounted subscription, you can get almost a third off of the price. So this is available exclusively when you go to the URL puri.com/metabolic link, or if you use the code metabolic link. So if you go to Puri, that's PUORI.com/metabolic link. That is amazing. And it echoes a lot of what I hear, from the low carb community too, and what I, personally saw in Andrew, Kutnick, the PhD student, even with his academic performance and his CGM, I guess, which is like, the proof is in the pudding, right? So I have questions in preparation for this podcast. I listened to over 10 hours of uh podcasts from the conventional side, type 1 diabetes masterclass and WebMD, medical doctors talking about type 1 diabetes. And I listened to a couple podcasts about misinformation, myths, and misinformation about type 1 diabetes in regards to going, they were specifically like talking about zero carb or very low carb, well, which is kind of what we're talking about. But the masterclass talked about patients that went through specific diabetes training programs where they went on a diet that was defined, quote unquote, low fat, very low fat, plant based, and whole foods. So where they took individuals and got transitioned them, to this type of diet, and they were able to increase their carbohydrates. So the whole idea behind some of the information that I was listening to in podcasts and even master classes on type 1 diabetes was about increasing carb intake and increasing insulin sensitivity. And a couple case reports they went through was like an individual or a woman went from 280 grams of carbs a day to almost 300 grams of carbs a day and cut her insulin in half. And so you know so I don't question that that's possible, but I wanted to get your kind of just being in going from a conventional doctor to questioning this approach, using it, and experientially you're seeing the benefits and you're plugged into the community. I've watched you give talks at Low Carb USA and other things, and within a very rapidly growing community here. Uh, what was your diet like? Were you doing more of a, because you said the high fat of the low carb diet kind of concerned you, did you try a low fat, plant-based, whole foods diet, or were you more or less eating croissants and bagels and breads and things like that prior to taking this approach?
Yeah, I was vegetarian for 15 years, and in fact, I became type 1. I was vegetarian, and then for about 5 years after that, and then when I went into a keto, I went into more meat-based for other reasons. So I won't go into that. But it was more of a Daphne approach. It was definitely whole foods, but I wasn't studying nutrition at the time. I was just eating. I wasn't really aware of the value of nutrition for therapeutic use at that stage.
Yeah.
So it was what I call a standard healthy diet, really
Yep.
low in fat, dairy, fish, certainly. Occasionally some meat, even though I was technically vegetarian. If I went to my mum couldn't understand,
Yeah.
she was, for example. And so it was, I would call it a healthy, higher carb, lower fat diet. And then when I transitioned back into animal meat, um, and fish as well, I was still on the lean cuts of meat and still obeying low fat and supplementing carbs with a Daphne sort of approach. So if somebody made me something sweet, I would have it and then inject insulin to suit. But by and large, it was brown everything, as far as grains go, lots of vegetables and what I'd call a traditional diet, really, but not too much junk.
Yeah.
But for me, that was a very difficult ask, and I could not manage to get my insulin levels down. In fact, my insulin volumes were going up all the time. And
Mhm.
I've heard about this approach before where people cut out fat and they just almost go onto carbohydrates. And I find that a difficult one to understand. But I do know of a friend of mine in the UK who's doing the same and getting equally good results. I find the mechanism quite difficult to gauge, really. But I mean, my expertise really is in keto, and I find that works very, very well indeed.
Yeah.
What I'm keen on really is that we exploit the body's ability to multi-fuel. And I think that is missing in the teaching of type 1 diabetes. I think we're obsessed to some degree with sugar levels, and we don't seem generally to pay that much attention to how we achieve a good sugar level.
Yeah.
So I use a CGM. I've used a CGM for all the time I've been keto. I self-fund it, but luckily in the UK we get it on the National Health Service now, and that makes the biggest difference. To education and to managing diabetes. It is best thing since insulin, really.
Mhm.
But I've always felt that if I'm not taking carbohydrates, I can reduce my insulin volumes, and I think that for me is important. And I can go into that a bit later if you want to, because I think there's lots of evidence now to suggest that the body likes to use ketone bodies or can use them. And I think there's some evidence in neurons that if you culture neurons, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong on this one.
Sure.
Culture
No,
neurons,
we study that. Yes.
they do actually take up ketones
Yes.
with the glucose. So that would suggest a cell preference in some cells for ketones. And of course, with the way of managing type one, conventionally, we're encouraging no production at all of ketones. We're saying you should never have ketones as a type 1 because
Yeah.
you'll go into diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a rather strange concept, really. And it's possible for type 1s to go into DKA, but not because of the way they choose to use a diet. So I think if we're insisting on a high carbohydrate diet, that comes at a cost of reducing our ability to burn ketones and burn fats. And we're starting to understand that mental health issues are sometimes caused by the inability to burn ketones. And then there's lots of exciting in your area, field of cancer, where we realize that hyperinsulinemia can make cancer worse. So my approach would be to reduce the insulin volumes as much as you possibly can. So I always say as little insulin as possible, but as much as you need, because it's not a race to the bottom. We're never going to get off insulin, so there's no point in kidding ourselves, as far as we know. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So we use the appropriate amount of insulin, but try to have the sort of lifestyle where we're minimizing its use. So we have to imagine what someone without type 1 diabetes, how would they get their insulin levels naturally low?
Mhm.
Well, that will be with probably with a ketogenic diet, so they don't need to stimulate the insulin. That will be intermittent fasting, almost certainly. That will be doing regular physical activity or whatever level, but probably a low level sort of fat burning zone where you won't be using much insulin. That will be decreasing your stress response if you can, and getting good quality sleep. So, and that in a non someone without diabetes would naturally produce low insulin levels. And I think we try as type ones to strive to achieve that as much as we can, because I think that will help us then enable our bodies to free up the fuel. So we've got 100,000 calories of fat sitting there doing nothing apart from being stored, and fat
Yeah.
in excess can become inflammatory in itself. So my approach will be to, it's not all about getting good levels of glucose, which is very important, but my experience is that if you get good insulin control, the glucose will follow. And sometimes I put up a graph of a perfect line of blood glucose, 56, 60 all day,
Yeah.
running 4 millimoles per litre all day. And I say, well, is that important how much insulin you use to give yourself that line? Because I think it is. I think if you're using smallest amount of insulin, that's probably healthy. But if you're using, say, 1,000 units of insulin a day, is that healthy? And I don't think it is healthy, even if you want to achieve normoglycemia. So I don't think it's type 1 control is all about chasing the glucose. I think if you chase the insulin, the glucose will follow that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have stated that, in a number of ways, and listening to your talks about basically really focusing on the insulin rather than the glucose, like managing your insulin. So when I listen to a number of other podcasts, they talk about, there's no discussion about what you mentioned, metabolic flexibility and getting your body fat adapted and keto adapted by using the lowest amount of, insulin you can. And I remember, there was one patient that they had on, and something that I was listening to, and they had for breakfast like an egg white omelet, and then for then they tried, they were eating like a chicken breast with on a salad, and they just mentioned having no energy at all until and then they were liberated by using this like whole foods plant-based approach, and then they're up to like 300 grams of carbs a day, but they weren't really talking about their CGM numbers and things like that. But I think people and this is in the context specifically, and I'm preferencing this because I want to talk about your running. This was mostly in the context of type 1 diabetes patients who were very active, who were athletes, and who thought that the only way that they could have energy was to really ramp up the carbohydrates and then manage it with insulin. Right. So there's a lot of discussion on there. I was actually part of American Diabetes Association conference, and I talked about glucose and insulin management for athletes. I was kind of surprised that I got the invitation to talk about it. But but this is a very big discussion in the type 1 diabetes community, like how to fuel your performance. And I would like you to share kind of your experience as being a runner, specifically being able to run 730-mile run in 5 weeks on low carb, and the process of, or if you did experience sort of I tell people with a ketogenic diet, if they say they tried it and it didn't work, if you're not in ketosis for at least 6 weeks and checking ketone levels for that duration of time, you're not giving your body, you have not tried the ketogenic diet, because I really do believe you need to get through that 6 weeks for that transition. And I would like to hear kind of your experience with transitioning to low carb or a ketogenic diet, and how you were able to manage your glucose levels and insulin levels doing such tremendous feats of running and putting out that amount of energy,
Yeah,
without carbohydrates.
yeah, that's right. That 700-mile run was meant to be 1,000, but it's the
Wow. Mhm.
longest distance in the UK, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nothing in the US terms, but for us, it's big. Okay.
No, that's insane for my
So
on my index. Yeah.
I'd just like to try just running from one end of the country to the other. And because I just got onto keto and very enthusiastic to show that it's all good, I adopted that policy. It wasn't an easy run, I must say. I started off by towing a buggy, but it wasn't the one I wanted, and I ended up getting a child sort of one that pulls behind a cycle, and that was horrible, and it would go straight, and all sorts of problems with it. But it was required for part of the run, because I was out of contact with anybody for 36 hours. It was just in the complete remote wilderness of Scotland, which is quite remote up there, especially if you walk through it at camp all night. Um, and had to take all my food with me. But I was well keto adapted. The problem with, if you're burning fat all the time and you're in aerobic exercise, so you don't need sugar. I mean, if you're anaerobic, of course, you will have to burn sugar from your glycogen stores. But there's evidence accruing, isn't there, especially from work that Tim Noakes and other sports scientists have been doing, that your fat burning zone can go right up to very high intense exercise, apart from the last 15% of your VO2 max. So at the level I'm operating, which I'm not an athlete at all. I've never got a medal apart from finishing. He finished a marathon, half marathon, whatever. So at my level, it's just putting your head forward and catching it up with your feet, really. Just jogging sort of speed, 10-minute miles, that sort of level I'm at now. And but if you're in ketosis, you can just keep going and going and going. And I occasionally have breakfasts if they're available. I tried to do camping, and then I would eat in the evening. That was for the first 12 days. And after that, I had to, for various reasons, get into accommodation, which was its own challenge in getting the distances right. Some of those were quite difficult. But then that was a morning fueling exercise, and then probably a lunch and a light evening meal. So it was 3 meals a day, snacking occasionally if my blood sugar went low. But I was hyper insulin sensitive, and my insulin volumes went right down to the single digits.
Wow.
I roughly halved my insulin volume, because I was fat burning, and there wasn't a lot of need for the. I mean, insulin is an energy controller of the whole body, but it didn't need to stick onto the GLUT4s in the muscles, the GLUT receptors in the muscles, because I was running off fat. So my insulin volumes were very low, and the one of the problems.
What were you eating? Sorry to interrupt, but what were you eating specifically? Like, what was your staple meals? I assume you had to carry all that food with you. Is that with the cart? Was
Well,
that
in the I did for the first week, because there's very
okay?
little.
It was remote area. Uh-huh.
But in remote areas, the shops are and they don't stock much stuff. So it was a lot of cured meats, a lot of sort of dairy. That was all I could sort of get really. I never cooked for the first while, but then as I started to get into into habitation, I was, there's never, you're never far from a shop in the UK, never. So I was able to sort of indulge in a little bit more fresh meat, and certainly in the evenings when I was at my restaurant or whatever, I could just go. It was mostly meat. It was all meat based by and large, eggs as well. That was my basic
Okay.
food, supplemented with green veg and things like that. Occasionally nuts, but I found nuts were quite irritant on the gut. But that's individual sort of thing, really. And some dairy. Dairy was very useful.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Fish too?
oh yeah, fish as
You
well.
eat
Fish,
a lot of fish? Okay.
meat. Sorry, fish and meat. I
Yeah.
sort of
Okay. Just curious.
it was all animal based by
Mhm.
and large, with supplement of green vegetables, and that was pretty well it. Very rarely any things like yogurts and things like that. I tended not to want those, so it's very much a ketogenic diet. One of the
Yeah.
problems, of course, is when ketos are flexible, metabolism flexible, and sometimes if you got it wrong or the blood sugar went up for whatever reason, clearly you'll be sugar burning then, and then until the sugar came out of your system again. But I don't think that knocked me out of ketosis. So I was never exhausted as a result of running,
Uh-huh.
ever in any day. I got tired, I got aching joints and all that, but
Yeah.
full recovery overnight. There's no injuries apart from the last week. I got a bursitis, and that was the thing that stopped the run. It was the worst pain I've ever had. It
Mhm.
was the worst ever pain. I don't want to repeat that. But apart from that, it was pretty successful. And as I say, very little in the way of tiredness, apart from the fact that you're running 20 miles a day, 25 miles a day, whatever, which is quite a big
Yeah.
ask of an
Yeah.
aging. You know,
Venison was a staple protein source in my diet for most of my life growing up because we grew up in a hunting family. So, several friends of mine and podcast hosts, including guys you may know, Tim Ferriss and Peter Attia, had mentioned how the harvesting of the axis deer by Maui Nui is protecting Hawaii's ecosystem and also supporting the local communities in that environment. So, I researched them. There's several YouTube videos that I recommend searching and seeing more about this organization. And I was really inspired by their mission. The mission, the taste, and the quality of the meat sticks really inspired us to partner with them. So it's a product that I use, that I love, especially when I'm traveling. So Maui Nui is offering the only 100% wild harvested meat it's harvested stress-free and responsibly sourced. It's perfect for anyone looking to sort of elevate the protein quality of their meals. The taste is amazing, and the they're far more sort of travel friendly than sardines, for example, if you're on a flight, especially when you're snacking, or I also have them in my office. So people can't smell sardines down the hall at the university. So Maui Nui Venison is offering the Metabolic Link listeners a limited collection of the favorite cuts and products, but the supply is limited by the nature of the work that they do, also the growing demand for this amazing product. So don't wait. Head to Maui Nui Venison / metabolic link to secure your access to this amazing protein source. Again, that's Maui Nui Venison. It's MAUI venison.com / metabolic link. That is amazing. I mean, after listening to like 10 hours of different podcasts on type 1 diabetes and brushing into athletics and people, how to manage carbs with being active, I don't think what you just told me is would be incomprehensible to like the mainstream type 1 diabetes community if just cover the main podcast or just even the American Diabetes Association does have a growing appreciation for a low carb approach. But what you just described is just really insane. As you know, and we know there's a handful of ultra marathon runners, like Zach Bitter and a few others that are kind of, doing this approach, but I'm not sure it's getting out there. And I think this has major implications for people because the safety alone is, in and of itself is I think so valuable to have that sort of umbrella, like it's like umbrella policy for type 1 diabetics to have your ketones elevated, which sounds very counterintuitive, but I'm sure that, you were running not only on fat, but also on ketones. Your central nervous system was using quite a bit of ketones, I would imagine. I don't know if you checked your blood, but it would be interesting to do blood work before, during, and after.
Yeah, the ketones throughout, I measured the ketones throughout, and they were about between
Yeah.
2 and 3 most of the time. At the moment, they're about zero point 0.7 to 1. They tend to
Mhm.
go beyond that. I think that's a healthy range for me.
Yeah.
Uh, the key thing for me, being a pretty disinterested person really in my diabetes,
Mhm.
it's a nuisance rather than an
Mhm.
asset.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
rather not have it, is that it's so freeing to be keto as a
Mhm.
type 1. I've not checked my blood glucose since about 3 hours ago, and I know it's going to be absolutely fine. I've got no
Yeah.
worry about going hypo during this during this interview, for
Yeah.
example. And the fantastic thing was, if after this someone came around and said, "Do you want to go for a run?" I wouldn't even hesitate, just put my stuff on and go, because I'm
Yeah.
fat. I don't need to worry. I know my sugar is going to be absolutely fine. Of course, I would check it. Of course, I take glucose with me when I go. Of course, I occasionally get caught out. But the freedom, the daily freedom to almost forget, it's forget, not ignore. I never ignore my diabetes. It's going to get me at some point, but I can forget it for the duration, which when I was on a high carb diet, I could never forget it. It was always knocking on the door saying, hang on, you got to deal with this hypo. You got to sort that
Mhm.
hyper out. But now, flat traces all day, every day, you can guarantee them, unless
Yeah.
there's a blip. So for me, it is important to try to live as long as you can, as healthily as you can. Of course it is. We all want to
Mhm.
do that. But the key thing is living right now. And I
Yeah.
feel great right now. And I've only got now. I don't know what's going to happen in an hour's time. So for
Mhm.
me, it's living right now that's important, and having that freedom. Not I can worry about other things other than my diabetes.
Yeah, I think that is the paramount point here, because if you're doing a high carb approach, you have to be hyper focused on checking your glucose levels, but also you become somewhat dependent, very dependent upon the amazing tools that are available: continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps, closed loops circuits. But what if you're, in a remote location camping, for example, and your CGM fails, when you're out on a hike? And of course, I mean, you can carry extra ones with you, but these things are going to happen.
Yes.
And I think, now we have the technology to make it easier to do a high carb approach because of the monitoring tools, the insulin pumps and things like that. But then it's, you can, I see low carb as being proactive versus reactive, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discussion, in the high carb approach, you have to be proactive versus reactive. But I think that is essentially what you're doing with insulin management and the low carb ketogenic approach. You're being very proactive instead of being obligated to be reactive with insulin administration to manage your carb intake. So yeah, just, I guess, it's very liberating to be low carb, uh and being on a ketogenic diet. So you have kind of very minimal requirements for using some of the tools that are available now. So I wanted to hear. I know I remember in your talk you showed a lot of data, which I want to get into because there were some interesting things that were changing your insulin sensitivity and glucose management. Uh, but just out of curiosity, what CGM do you use, and how do you go
I
about
use the
managing?
Freestyle Libre 2, which is
Okay.
available on the National
Yep.
Health
Yep.
Service. So
I
that's
have them right here. Yep. I got a bunch of them. Mhm.
absolutely fine for me. I mean, they're not that accurate, I must say. They're accurate enough,
Yeah.
but and they are frustrating. I mean, they're the best thing ever since insulin. If you
Mhm.
said what are the top two things you'd have for type 1 diabetes, apart from saying I wouldn't have it, I would say it's insulin and then CGMs. They're so
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah.
Always, you can spot a trend very quickly,
Yeah.
but they're always late. For example, the other day I had a low, and it was squawking away. But I thought, well, yeah, thanks very much for letting me know. But I've known for 20 minutes that I need to get some sugar,
Hmm.
and then
Hmm.
they start squawking away. So there's
Yeah.
this delay, which obviously is important when you've got a closed loop or a hybrid loop system or something linked to a pump. Obviously, the
Mhm.
algorithms account for that,
Mhm.
but and they often run, a few points up or down. They tend to
High. Usually high for me.
high.
Mhm.
They tend to run a bit high, don't they? Which
Mhm.
is safe,
Mhm.
but but that it's not brilliant. But they're great. I think they're great, and I think if you're on a keto diet and you combine that with a loop system and a pump, I mean that is as good as it can possibly get.
Mhm.
Um, I can't think of if you want to carry a pump around with you, if you don't knock them off all the time or they don't
Mhm.
fail. I mean that technology is as good as it can get, really. I do know people who are type one and training for long distance runs who tend to abandon them because the algorithms for some of the pumps certainly don't
Mhm.
quite understand where the glucose will rise a bit when you start your exercise, and then of course they dumps a bit of insulin in, and then of course it might be too much because it will naturally
Yeah.
come down in 20 minutes. So people, that's just a refinement issue there. That's always been going on.
Mhm.
But I'm a little bit more concerned about the idea that, oh, you can just eat what you like and the pump will sort you out, because I don't think that's
Yeah.
necessary. I think for two reasons. You're going to eat food that is probably ultra processed, which is not the best. So it's high refined food, and it's going to require a huge amount of insulin to counteract that. And your pump's
Yeah.
going to be whirring away. You certainly get the value out of your pump because the pump motor will be whirring away endlessly, just trying to control all this. But I think my view is, and having studied this quite a lot now, is that we should be focusing on reducing insulin volumes to as low as we possibly can. We put it into the skin. We put insulin in the wrong place. So it is always at a higher level in type 1s than it is in non-type 1s.
Yeah.
So to get ourselves around that, we try to use minimal insulin. And and not fool ourselves that we're ever going to give it up, but just work with our bodies to be sensitive to stress, to be sensitive to physical activity, to be sensitive to diet, and sensitive to sleep, and adjust our insulin appropriately. And it honestly it isn't as dire as it sounds. It's actually freeing. It's not an
Yeah.
imposition, because those tiny little tweaks free you up to get on with your life without having to worry about it. You can, of course, get obsessed with anything, but you don't have to. And
Mhm.
it's just understanding the way insulin works in all
Yeah.
scenarios. Then you're free and you're in control.
So you are of the opinion, and I actually asked this provocative question at a conference of people who were not really low carb advocates. I asked the question, and I guess you would agree with it, that the lowest amount of insulin we could use to manage type 1 diabetes, pretty much the better off you're going to be. And that would apply pretty much across the spectrum of all people, right? And kind of, I asked that there was several endocrinologists in there, and everyone kind of agreed. And then I talked about low carb diets and stuff, and they didn't. It was interesting. No one really challenged it, but they did challenge what they challenged was they didn't challenge it in theory, the idea of low carb for the metabolic management of type 1 diabetes and using the lowest amount of insulin possible. But there was questions about the compliance to the diet, and then the sustainability and things like that. So, and I know that's kind of maybe the barrier to entry for some people is just the restrictive nature of the diet and low carb. I don't really find it restricting, but maybe talk a little bit about that. And I want to transition to a little bit to if type 1 patients experience the dawn effect, and then a little bit into which you gave a really elegant talk on the non-carb sources of insulin spikes or elevations of glucose. So kind of like a multi-part question there, but
Yeah, so I think with respect to low insulin, that's my thing right now. I
Mhm.
looked at it all and seen the work of people like yourself and the cancer specialists and the people who are dealing with mental health. I'll pose the question, bipolar disease is very well treated with a keto diet. Well, what
Yeah.
if you have type 1 with bipolar? how are you going to advise them? Because if you're a conventional endocrinologist, you're going to be saying, well, you should stay out of ketosis at all costs because your diabetes is safer for them, not necessarily for the patient. But then the psychiatrist would say, no, 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 I want my patient to go onto a ketogenic diet. So the two silos are going to have to join together and work a formula out. So it does present its own challenges. So the thing about low insulin is that, type 1s can tell you, as somebody with no diabetes, we can tell you how much insulin your body needs because we have to put it in. So we can tell you about, insulin in stress. We can tell you about insulin in the dawn effect. We can tell you about insulin in infection, for example. And, when I had COVID, it was a boring, really routine COVID. There's nothing exciting about it. 3 times as much insulin required, for example. Wow. So someone with no diabetes would also be producing 3 times as much insulin, except they wouldn't know about it. So I think that's quite an important idea, that we understand how insulin works in the non-diabetic, if you see what I mean. Because we having diabetes, we can tell you how much insulin you need within reason, with the limitation that we put into the skin. And what was the second part of your question? We were talking about, oh yes, stress hormones. So we do know the dawn effect. Obviously, if you're young and you've still got growth hormone, growth hormone will suppress the expression of insulin from about 3 or 4 in the morning. And growth hormone, of course, puts sugar levels, glucose levels up. So that will be a spike in the morning. For the rest of us, things like cortisol wakes us up. That cortisol raises blood sugar. Interesting, cortisol, because it's not a bad hormone. It's an anti-inflammatory hormone. And there's some ideas, and you probably know more about this than me, that immune cells, some types of immune cells prefer glucose as their fuel. And it may be that the cortisol rise is there to feed them, because not all cells like the same fuel. The body is selective in the sorts of fuel it likes to use, isn't it? And certain cell types require certain types of energy from preferential glucose or preferential ketones or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, and the constant background stress of adrenaline, of your daily hassle of life, and of course poor sleep when you're not taking control of your sleep, by having coffee late at night, by eating late at night, you put up your insulin resistance, so you're going to need more insulin for that, and that's going to be more difficult to bring down. So insulin sensitivity is desirable, and of course if you do get the effect, you have to correct it, because a person with no diabetes will be naturally correcting it. They will just be squirting out a little bit of insulin from the pancreas, and they'll be sorting it out. So we have to say, oh well, that's right, that's the dawn effect, that's due to growth hormone or whatever. So let's do what a non-diabetic pancreas would do. Let's just put some insulin into the system. So it's constant little checks and balances across what I call the five roots of health. Diet, sleep, our lived environment, stress, and physical activity. And adjusting your dose according to all of those. And it doesn't require endless adjustment. It just requires judicious use at the right time. So it's not an imposition. Obviously, a pump, you can program it to do all that. So it's much more convenient if you want to use a pump. But pumps come with hassle as well as convenience. So only you as a person with type 1 can decide if you want the pump. But yeah, so it's about micro managing, but not being obsessional, and it just makes life easier. It's honestly easier to manage appropriately, rather than worry about getting your blood glucose up to like 200 and then having to make a big correction, and then watching it all come shooting down again, and then having to gobble up some sweeties because you've gone low, and that's the good old-fashioned sort of way of going on, isn't it?
When was the last time you needed to go to a doctor, but you put it off? You made an excuse. I'm too busy. It's going to heal on its own. This actually happened recently when a cow stepped on my foot. Thought it broke my foot, so I had to scramble, find a doc, urgent care. So I think we've all been there. Booking a doctor's appointment is kind of like a daunting process when you're so busy. So ZocDoc makes it super easy to find a doctor that's right for you. So ZocDoc is free. It's a free app that has a website where you could search and you compare high quality vetted out doctors in your network, and you can literally instantly book an appointment. So we're talking about booking an in-network appointment with more than 100,000 doctors across different specialties. So there's doctors that focus on mental health. I need a dentist, so there's dental health, there's primary care, there's urgent care. and more. So you can filter out the doctors that take your insurance. It's really important. You filter out the doctors according to your location. And so again, they're vetted out. You look for doctors. All the doctors are highly rated by verified patients. So once you find the right doctor, you can actually see their actual appointment openings, and then you can just choose a time slot that works for you and book it instantly. So appointments made through ZocDoc also happen to be super fast. So typically within 24 to 72 hours, you can book an appointment. Many people can book on ZocDoc the same day appointments. So this is the product I'm now using. I highly recommend it. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments like we all do, and go to zocdoc.com/metabolic link and to find and instantly book a top rated doctor today. So again, that's ZocDoc, ZocDoc.com/metabolic link.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting with the dawn effect. Then the cortisol, like I'm used to, I've measured, my cortisol and kind of follow that literature, but I forgot about the growth hormone
Mm.
too, which you're saying would peak sort of in the morning. And I know, people who use growth hormone, if they take too much, it causes insulin resistance and hyperglycemia. So that's a common. And then yeah, the benefits of that, but also the anti-inflammatory benefits of cortisol. So that dawn effect is really, I get so many questions about this, is really an appropriate, a natural diurnal circadian physiological response.
Mm. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep.
And of course, if we keep that response going into the evening by using blue light and by all those sort of stimulation, mental stimulation, we suppress our melatonin at the night time, so we have high cortisol levels throughout the day where they shouldn't be high at night. They should be low at night, and melatonin should
Yeah.
be high to help us to sleep. So
Yeah.
it's important to understand our circadian rhythms with respect to how insulin works. And
Mhm.
I sort of teach that as part of my education of type ones, really, so they can work with it.
Mhm. Is there any particular supplements? You mentioned melatonin, and that is a supplement that I actually take, and I know there's kind of divided opinions about that. I've been taking it since the 90s,
Yeah.
more so for the neurological benefits. But are there any supplements that, type 1 diabetics should preferably use? Are there things that come up in blood work where there's, deficiencies, and any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Personally, I'm not a great supplement person, but I do use vitamin D
Mhm.
as an oral formulation for in the winter months, about 3 to 4 thousand units a day, just to try to keep the vitamin D levels up, because vitamin D is an important hormone, and it's obviously involved in calcium management. Of course, it's a bit late now, but calcium is involved in the release of insulin from the pancreas, for example. So, and people with type 1 have lower vitamin D levels normally than people without on presentation. Um, Other supplements, the sort of the chromium and the curcumin and all that, I think they may have use uh, for improving insulin resistance. But I haven't studied that, and perhaps that should be something I should be doing. Vitamin C, I think that's probably useful if you get an infection, because you need an antioxidant at some point to take up the slack. But I wouldn't personally take it every single day, because I think I'm relatively low inflammatory level based on my inflammatory markers. So I don't think I need a supplement, because vitamin C obviously is water soluble. It doesn't last long in the system anyway. Um,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, any other supplements that you can think of? I mean, zinc and all of the B vitamins are responsible for
Yeah.
the energy enzymes. I think if you have a well balanced, that's a terrible word, sorry. If you have a real food diet that
Mhm.
is complete in the amount of protein, and it's relatively unrefined, I think if you just eat that alone, you should get enough supplementation. But of
Mhm.
course, insulin is lacking, and the downstream effects of insulin may impact on some of our needs for increased supplementation in certain areas. I'm afraid
Yeah.
that's not my area of expertise, but I'm not against supplementation. It's just I haven't studied it to that degree.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, with the insight that you have with insulin administration and using a CGM, you would be able to kind of parse out and determine what supplements truly do increase insulin sensitivities. The chromium picolinate's been around for a while. You have berberine and dihydroberberine and different supplements out there that people are using, instead of metformin, and typically for in the context of type 2 diabetes. So which type 1 can convert to type, you could have both, right? So a type 1 diabetic can, become a type 2 diabetic.
I think nearly every type 1, having had type 1 for more than 15 years, they're probably type 2 as well, just because of
Yeah.
the relative high insulin levels we have to have because we put it into our skin.
Uh-huh. Yep. And the one thing I want to ask you about sunlight too. I mean, we talked about vitamin D, and maybe I've been kind of going down that rabbit hole on just sun and just photobiomodulation, red light, and just it's kind of interesting area of literature that I haven't really paid a whole lot of attention to, that I'm reading up on now. And if you think that's important outside of the obvious contribution of elevating vitamin D, but kind of big believer in just being outside and just nature, and just probably just from a psychological standpoint too, that could impact your glucose levels. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I had a chat with Sarah Pugh, who's quite she's a quantum biologist, and she
Hmm.
made an amazing sort of statement that we only get a third of our electrons from food, and the rest comes from other sources, of which ultraviolet
Wow.
light is one of them. Yeah, that was mind blowing to me. So I had to have a chat with her about that. And but getting outside in the morning, you get rid of the windows because you have to get your UVB to stimulate the production of not just vitamin D but also melatonin, and that's quite important. And I think if you can get out into green spaces, I think for mental health reasons that's really good. But sunlight, vitamin D is obviously the biggest sort of the biggest beneficiary of sunlight. Obviously, vitamin D naturally produced, because vitamin D produced from sunlight is more closely regulated than vitamin D from your diet. So
Mhm.
I think for those reasons it's useful to get out,
Yeah.
certainly in the mornings, to get your rays really. They're not that strong at that time of day, and they do have extra benefits, as you say, and you know more about this than me, obviously, on improving not only your vitamin D status, but also other energy pathways. Sunlight going into the eye is very stimulating for the pineal gland, for example, and we
Yeah.
have non-visual receptors in the eye, and including vitamin D receptors that actually register the light that's going into our eye and signal that to the brain. And of course, a lot of that is ultraviolet, and if we're in the behind glass, we just don't get it. So being outside, it has many benefits, and of course we've only been indoors for 150 years or 100 years, and before that,
Yeah.
electric lighting completely screws up our circadian rhythm. For example, we never had electric lighting years ago. I mean, the sunrise and the sunset are red. That probably tells us something about the sort of light we should be focusing on, as human beings, because we probably have adapted our our biology to that type of, that sort of rhythm, that 24-hour cycle.
Yeah, super important. I think to synchronize your circadian, and we have photodetectors, receptors in our skin and even in our brain. I think it's kind of an interesting area of research. But in the interest of time, I want to talk a little bit about the type 1 diabetes retreat that I think you're involved in, and Calm Grove. And I just clicked on, and on your blog, I noticed that that was there. And what did intriguing, amazing idea to have that as part of, because you really do need to sit down with people and have a predetermined amount of time to kind of go through the concepts and have them experience,
Yeah,
all the benefits. So I'd love to hear about that.
thank you. That's great. So it's only just happened, so it's fresh in my mind. We're still sort of producing, we're still chatting with the people because we followed them up for a year. So it was a 6-day course. It was 6 days more because that's the way that a particular establishment wanted it to work. So that was absolutely fine. I think we can probably do it in less time, but it was basically a 6-day residential course at a health resort. It wasn't a clinical setting, and I provided all of the technical sort of bad cop sort of stuff, and then the important sort of classroom sort of information to help people understand how insulin works. So it was called insulin optimization rather than diabetes management. And so we looked at we call them 5 roots of health, which we've talked about throughout this podcast. And each day we concentrated on one of those roots of health. And throughout that time, we had experts who were keto type ones who were experts in each root of health. So we had somebody on food, somebody on physical activity, someone on sleep, blah, blah, blah. So I was the only medical person there. I made myself available 24 hours a day, but my medical skills were never called upon during the whole of 6 days. We had a pilot. This was a pilot. We had 10 people. Every single person reduced their insulin volumes, and every single person got their insulin into a really good range. You know, someone who had a quite a bad eating disorder and was very sort of compulsive eater. She managed to get her glucose below her limit was 8, and she managed to get it into 5 or 6 every day. And psychologically for her, that was a really big barrier to get below that. She was scared stiff of going below 8, for example. So what we tried to do was take people out of a clinic environment, help them to manage it themselves. They all had to have continuous glucose meters. I didn't care whether they had pumps or pens or whatever, that wasn't the problem, but fully understand insulin, you know, how it works biochemically, what hormones it interacts with, what other hormones affect insulin, you know, how long does it last, how is it degraded, you know. So they you know, we had lots of chat time and questions at the end, and everyone got it. Everyone got this idea of multi-fueling. Everyone got the idea that natural ketosis is normal. And they were the key things. They just learned that those very key things that gave them the confidence not to have to always worry, have this mystery of what insulin is. You know, once they understand it and can work with it, and then it becomes a tool rather than something that, oh my God, I'm about to go hypo because I've just injected some insulin or whatever. You know, so very successful. We're hoping to repeat it in July and again in September in the UK. But more importantly, we're trying to set up a system where we can offer this to our National Health Service, certainly train up healthcare professionals to provide this. That is a big ask, but it's an ambition. If you don't have ambitions, you're not going to achieve them. But it's the biggest ask. But right now, I'm happy just to provide this for smaller numbers of people. But if we can just get started, we'll get the expertise, and those people will spread the word, and it could be a ground up revolution. And of course, my medical skills weren't required. This was delivered by people with type 1 diabetes, helping out fellow type 1s. And I think that was a very important departure from what is perceived as a very difficult to manage condition. We did screen our participants, and we were very careful in how we screened them to make sure that this was a safe practice. But having done a survey and having got quite a lot of experience in this area, I reckon we can get at least 80% of all people with type 1 safely through that sort of course, which is quite, when I looked at those figures, I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive. You know, I thought, no, we're going to be cherry picking here, which is going to take the easy wins. But no, we can get quite a lot of people through, you know, with a system whereby we are mentoring and supporting and providing information. Once people have got that information, then they've got power. They can do what they want with it. And if they choose not to do a keto diet, good for them. But at least they understand how the whole thing works. And then they, you know, they're all fired up right now. And this is 4 weeks down the line. They're all doing really, really well. They've got a chat group and they're supporting each other. And it's a fantastic program. And I just hope we can replicate it elsewhere, because it does work. And you know, it's like the principle of starfish, isn't it? Oh, we're not making much of a difference. Well, we made a difference to those people, if you see what I mean. You know, threw those people back in the sea, and they're doing okay. Yeah.
I'm sure you're learning a lot too, but like what works, what doesn't work. And I did have a question, like how many people do you think are teachable that would embrace this approach? And I think you more or less answered it, that about 80% of people, I think with the right guidance, could learn about this approach. And then of course they have to experience it to figure out if it's going to be for them. But yeah, it's, you know, thank you for spearheading this. And I think, you know, it has so much to offer, because you know, people with type 1 diabetes really think there's only kind of one approach, you know, that is just managing glucose with insulin and just eating whatever they want. And they see that as liberating. But in the long run, when it comes to, you know, your lifestyle and safety, too. I mean, there's just so many advantages to low carb. I don't understand why it's not getting more traction. It kind of is now, but you're leading, spearheading this, and I think it's helping out tremendously, in the UK and then in the US too. Just coming over here to speak about it is a big step forward.
Wonderful opportunity, and I thank the organisers very much for that Low Carb USA. And it's getting the information out there. People choose what they do with information, but they need information. They're desperate for it, aren't they? They just want
Yep.
it.
Yep.
We just need to get it out there and shout it so they know it. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, speaking of information, so how can people find you? How can they follow you? And what advice would you give for people that, are curious about this route and just want to take the next step?
Yeah, thank you. I've got a website called type1keto.com, type and then the number one and then keto.com, which is where I provided it as a sort of resource really for how to get started, what sort of diet to use, how it all works really. And for healthcare professionals, there's some healthcare professional accredited courses which attract CME points. And one of those is a 6-hour, just get me started, what on earth are my type 1s talking about sort of course. And then the other one goes into more depth, a little bit like the level we've been talking about today. And then the Coombe Grove courses are obviously accessible through there. And we're having 15 people in July, and then we'll build up as needed. But we need a smaller environment so people can interact well. So yeah, type1keto.com is my main resource. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, but X, sorry. But I put a bit out on X, but my main resource is type1keto.com. Thank you.
Thank you for watching or listening to this episode of the Metabolic Link. If you like this episode, please leave us a review. It really helps us boost and get the message out there. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel and watch the full version of this video each episode. And don't forget to leave us a comment or two. We also upload private episodes to the Metabolic Link that are completely ad-free to our medical education platform, if you're interested in that. So that's at the Metabolic Initiative. So you can find more information at membership.metabolicinitiative.com. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.
Do you love learning about metabolic health? So do we. It's why we created the Metabolic Initiative, an online educational platform providing evidence-based education on metabolic health and therapies for healthcare professionals and the general public. By joining the Metabolic Initiative, you'll gain access to hundreds of expert lectures, interviews, panel discussions, and even private episodes of the Metabolic Link. CMEs are available. Go to metabolicinitiative.com to get started. And as always, thank you for listening to the Metabolic Link.